Chapter 18. The Launch. Shellington hummed to himself, putting down a box of equipment in his laboratory. He had been unpacking for the past couple days, like all the other Octonauts with him. Shellington had already put a lot of his personal belongings in his room, and now focused on his laboratory. His laboratory. He liked the sound of that. He never thought he would have the luxury of one so shortly after college. And it was just getting better and better. Because today was the day the Octonauts will launch. A thrill shot through him for the 20th time that day. Of course, he'd have to get everything unpacked by 1 p.m. That was when all the crew needed to arrive at the HQ to begin launching procedures. It would be in 1 hour. Shellington narrowed his eyes determinedly as he looked at the last stack of boxes in front of him. He'll be able to make it. But just as he opened the first box, he heard a crash and a yelp from the hallway. Shellington immediately stood up. Was that creature all right? He came to the automatic doors. They opened to reveal the dog, Dashi, trying to put her belongings back into a cardboard box. There was stuff scattered all over the floor. "Do you need help, Dashi?" the scientist asked. He knelt to the ground and picked up a book. "That would be lovely, thanks." It seemed like objects for a room. Some makeup, a pair of headphones, more books. He took a couple more things and put it into the box, shuffling right next to Dashi. "I'm really sorry. What was your name again?" Dashi's laughter seemed jovial, but there was something else underneath it. "It's Shellington," he replied. "Don't worry, it's kind of a mouthful. Quasi had a bit of a hard time, too, when I first talked to him, but I think he's got it now." By the way Peso acted whenever the pirate was brought up, Shellington felt like he should somehow be more wary of Quasi, yet he couldn't really bring himself to be that concerned. He trusted that Inkling and the captain had done their homework, and from what Shellington could tell, Quasi's actions were all clean and legal, albeit enthusiastic. He guessed they would just have to wait and see. "Who's Quasi?" Shellington stopped at that. Dashi looked down, clearly embarrassed. "Oh, Shellington tried to backtrack. "He's the orange tabby, the pirate." "Oh, okay," Dashi said. Silence followed. Shellington shifted a bit. "The Octonauts have been here for, several weeks?" Quasi was the Octonaut who stuck out the most, with his eye patch and energetic demeanor. If she didn't even remember his name, did she not remember anyone else? Did she even care? "How's the move going?" Dashi asked abruptly. "Almost done?" It was clear that she was trying to make small talk, smother the awkwardness. He let her. "There's still a lot to be done," Shellington replied, "but I'll be able to make it." He needed to keep the conversation going. "How about you?" "This is the last box," Dashi said. The contents were all back in the container, and she lifted it back up. She looked like she was ready to bolt. "Do you want me to help after I'm done unpacking?" she asked anyway. He considered a bit, but then shook his head. "Thank you for the offer, but that won't be necessary." He had a feeling that it wouldn't be a good idea to include Dashi. Besides, Shellington would have to figure out where each piece of equipment will go, and unfortunately, no one else could really help with that. "All right, but if you need anything, then please let me know." Dashi always sounded really polite. Not just the content of her words, but her voice itself. It had a mellow calmness to it, like she was one of those secretaries he would talk to on the phone. Although it sounded sweet, Shellington could now hear a certain coldness to it. Not a hostile coldness, but a sort of detached kind. Like the politeness was all there was to her, and there wasn't really anything deeper than that. Like there couldn't be a way to get more of a friendship out of her. Shellington found himself mentally sighing at that. Such a shame. "Thanks," Shellington replied. "Same to you." Dashi quirked a quick smile, a bit too quickly, before speeding down the hall. Shellington went back to the laboratory, back to the stack of boxes. He took a small watch out of his book bag and became surprised at the time, throwing all his thoughts about the dog out the window. 12:15 p.m. He put his watch back and looked at the huge stack. His eyes narrowed. He'll have to make it. Line break. "Quasi. Here, matey. Peso. Here. Tweak. Here." Captain Barnacles walked in front of the row of creatures in the HQ, checking off their names on a clipboard. "Dashi. Here." "Sorry I'm late," a Scottish accent rang. Shellington jumped through the octochute. He landed and put his paws on his knees, panting. Captain Barnacles found himself grinning slightly. The sea otter's concern was endearing. "Don't worry, Shellington. You're just in time." He checked off the scientist's name. Shellington sighed in relief. Captain Barnacles looked through the list again. "Everyone is accounted for," the captain announced. "We're ready to launch." A wave of anticipation coursed through the HQ. After all the training, all the preparation, it was just about to pay off. Everyone held their breath. "Begin Phase 1. Octonauts, to your stations." And just like that, the HQ became empty, save for Captain Barnacles, Dashi, and Inkling. The professor leaned forward on his hover chair, courtesy of Tweak, and steepled 2 of his tentacles. "Dashi," the captain ordered, "activate security cameras." "On it, sir." Dashi pressed a couple of buttons, and one of the television monitors came to life. Several cameras were on, showing multiple sections of the ship. After a few moments, they saw through the screen Peso arriving in the medical bay. The Vegemals arrived in the garden pod. A few minutes later, Tweak, Shellington, and Quasi appeared in the launch bay. The Octonauts in the HQ could see Tweak pull a lever, and the staircase shot out of the walls of the launch bay, spiraling down to the front door. Once the staircase was in place, the 3 Octonauts wasted no time in climbing down the steps and leaving the door. Captain Barnacles pressed a button on his collar. "All of the Octonauts are in position." His voice echoed throughout the octopod, being carried through the intercom system. He could see the Vegemals perk up at the sound. It must be working. Theoretically, the Octonauts outside the octopod should be able to hear it too, through the radios attached to their collars. But just to be sure. "Tweak, can you hear me?" "Loud and clear, Cap." Her voice was slightly distorted by the radio, but it was discernible. It was definitely better than the average walkie-talkie. "All right. Open the warehouse door." A large grating sound reached their ears. Captain Barnacles glanced at Dashi, worried about the dog, but she didn't move. The only clue that showed her discomfort was her lips, which were tightly pressed together. Soon, sunlight shined through the HQ's window, and the warehouse door stopped moving. They could see the seaport the warehouse was on. The Atlantic Ocean was beyond that, spreading out to the horizon. The captain's heart lifted at the beautiful sight. Captain Barnacles pressed the radio button on his collar. "Tweak, I'm about to start the launching procedure. Make sure the route is clear." "Got it, sir." At that, the captain turned to the dog. "Dashi, activate the steering wheel." Captain Barnacles hurried to the center of the room. With the push of a couple buttons from Dashi, the polar bear felt the metallic ground lift up from under him. He was grateful that Dashi had this position. Now he didn't have to run from the dashboard to the rising platform like he did all those nights when he was practicing. It was a lot easier with the team. The steering wheel came into view as he entered a small chamber above the HQ. The platform stopped moving. Captain Barnacles flexed his fingers before grabbing the wheel and stick shift. "Captain, the route is clear." Tweak's voice. "Okay, beginning the move now." Captain Barnacles undid the brake and lightly put on the accelerator. The octopod went forward, meeting the noonday sun. It went down the slightly sloping road towards the shore, using the wheels attached to the bottom of the tentacles that touched the ground. It was much easier to drive in the daylight than he anticipated. All the practice had paid off. The wheel felt natural under the captain's paw, and he led the octopod, winding this way and that, down the path for the next 10 minutes. Eventually, they arrived on the beach. There was a small wooden boardwalk there, jutting out into the water. Captain Barnacles made sure to keep the octopod far enough away from it as he drove the giant metallic octopus into the ocean. The waves gently lapped against the octopod as they descended, deeper and deeper into the water. There were several bumps and small drops as they descended. Eventually, the octopod was completely submerged, and Captain Barnacles was able to see the underside of the ocean. Fish swam this way and that, trying to get away from the strange orange thing that just came into the water. Barnacles felt a bit bad for the intrusion, but they'll get out of the fish's way soon enough. Line break. Dashi watched the ocean outside the HQ window, then glanced at the security cameras. The submarine had stopped moving, parked at the sandy bottom. She looked at all the dials on the dashboard. Everything was going according to plan. She made sure to focus on the equipment instead of her feelings of embarrassment. That whole conversation was botched through and through. At least she won't ever forget Shellington's name again. The tightening of her stomach made sure of that. The captain's voice came on the intercom, and Dashi's back became ramrod straight, her personal thoughts abandoned. The octopod has been successfully submerged. Dashi knew that the announcement was for the crew members who were still on the shore. Begin Phase 2. That was her cue. "I'm opening the octo hatch and part of the ventilation system," Dashi announced over the intercom. She looked at the dashboard, filled with several buttons of various sizes. Now, which one was it? She mused, recalling her training. After a moment, she pressed a couple of them, 2 green ones, right next to each other, and pushed a lever slightly forward. A notification on the computer screen said that the octo hatch and a third of the vents to the outside were open. Dashi smirked. Nailed it. At least she was good at one area of her life. Line break. Tweak stood in the gut bay, poised for action. All the gups had been moved to the shore and now sat on the beach. The waves lightly pushed them back and forth. Tweak, Shellington, Quasi, her friend Tom, and another worker named Chris were in their respective gups, waiting for the signal. The still broken gup F was attached to the gup C by a tow line. Tweak couldn't help herself. Maybe she'd be able to fix the gut Beth later on, as a side project. Dashi said that she was opening the hatch and vents. That meant that they were beginning to put water into the octopod, which would be necessary for portions of the submarine. The launch bay needed it so the gups could enter and exit the octopod easily. The medical bay needed a pool for patients to have a place to stay, if necessary. Also, they needed a plumbing system for daily necessities, such as cooking and watering the plants in the garden pod. For those latter needs, there was a filtration system that would take the seawater and convert it into fresh water. Once Tweak was on board the main sub, she'd have to make sure that system was working right. The radio turned on again. It was the captain. "All gups, please report to the octopod." It was time. Tweak started the gup A, the battery-run engine roaring to life. She closed her eyes in bliss as she heard the other gups' engines turn on. No words could describe how good it felt that what she imagined actually existed now, instead of just white lines on blue paper. It made her want to go through the process all over again, even when a couple days ago she had felt so worn out over it. How strange things can be, especially with projects and emotions. Tweak drove the gup A into the water, passing by the wooden boardwalk where Sandy had first told her about Professor Inkling. Again, she was blown away by how much had changed. The other gups followed her, but she wasn't in the front for long. She saw the gup B's newly painted eyes and teeth as it zoomed past her, going far ahead from the rest of the group. Tweak smirked. Quasi was so excited to ride that gup. He must be having a ball. But as the octopod came into view, and the gup B's still zipped towards it, her smile dropped into horror. "Quasi, slow down!" she yelled into the intercom. He was going to hit the octopod. But it did not end in disaster. "Don't worry, matey, I got it," Quasi replied. He sounded at ease, and soon enough, the gup B slowed down right in front of the octopod. Tweak was sure that he hit the brakes too hard. Wished that he had slowed down earlier than the last second. But Tweak couldn't help but sigh in relief anyway. She really didn't want anything to go wrong today, especially something that could result in someone getting hurt. Eventually, the other gups caught up to Quasi and entered the octopod through the octohatch. That entrance was a somewhat tight fit, but other than Shellington's gup wobbling a bit as he entered, everyone got in with no mishap. Tweak drove up the launch bay and eventually surfaced within the room. She had seen the room hundreds of times, designed and helped build it from the inside, but now seeing the launch bay fully operational, with the pool filled and the computer screens whirring to life, she saw it all with new eyes. She couldn't believe that she had a paw in creating this. She was blown away. A knock on her windshield startled her out of her thoughts. "Mind if I come in?" Tom asked, an amused twinkle in his eyes. Chris, a koala, stood a couple steps behind him. "Oh, that's right. Tweak had to take Tom and Chris back to the shore. They couldn't stay here, after all." "Oh, sure," Tweak fumbled, pulling a lever. The windshield opened, allowing the engineers to hop in. "Sorry about that." Tim oofed a bit as he jumped inside. "No problem," Chris said for him as he came in. Tom stood next to her and leaned against the dashboard, looking at the launch bay. "It's a real pretty piece of work, isn't it?" Tweak could only agree. She backed up the gup and dove down, coming out of the octohatch. Chris looked out of the porthole as they went away from the great submarine. "I'm gonna miss this bucket of bolts," Tom chuckled, but then he grew a bit silent. Tweak glanced at him. "This has been a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and it's been really helpful for my family. I don't know what we would have done if we didn't have this when Darlin closed down." "Tom, you don't have to thank me," Tweak murmured. "It was only the right thing to do, after all. I'm just glad it all worked out for everyone. Still, I'd like to thank you just the same." The gup landed on the shore, taken farther onto the beach by the waves. Tweak looked up at Tom. She acquiesced. "You're welcome." Line break. Peso looked over the short glass wall that enclosed the pool in the medical bay. The water had been rising, swirling and gurgling like a whirlpool, for the last several minutes. The pool ran deep, all the way to the floor where the launch bay was. If he leaned forward and looked down at a specific angle, he could see the glass wall that looked out into the launch bay. He could see the gups arrived inside there. But he kept an eye out on the water level, always on the water level. He had the job of making sure that the two bays don't overfill with water. He had already alerted Dashi to turn off the hatch/vents that led into the launch bay, and now he was waiting for the medical bay to finish. He looked around the room, at all the cabinets where he had earlier stocked his supplies, the great table where patients could be on, and the plastic see-through containers that could be filled with water so he could work on small patients. His features relaxed. This really was the coolest job in the world. But his eyes widened, and he snapped his head towards the tank. He let out a breath as he realized that the water level hadn't budged. That was a close one. He shouldn't let his eyes wander too far. A movement caught his eye, and he leaned forward again to see better. The launch bay was empty, save the parked gups. The gut bay came back up, and Tweak jumped out of the mini-sub onto the platform. She walked by the glass tank before disappearing. A couple seconds later, the radio on his collar turned on. He jumped a bit at the noise, but then muttered under his breath. He'd been scared every time the intercom link had turned on today. There would be a lot of radio transmissions in this job. He has to learn how to deal with it. "This is Tweak," the engineer's voice came on. "I'm going to do a water check. I saw the launch bay. Everything's fine here. How's the medical bay going?" He waited, expecting an Octonaut to reply. "Oh, wait. That's directed at him, isn't it?" "It's going well, so far," he replied, remembering to push the button on the collar, though he still hoped that he could be heard clearly. "The tank's still filling up. It's about—" He gauged the water level again. "3/4 done." "Great," Tweak said. "Once it's filled up, let us know, okay?" "Okay," he replied cheerfully. He wasn't too bothered that she repeated the instructions. She may not have known that that was what he was doing, or maybe she just wanted to remind him. In any case, he did let them know once it filled up, and after a moment, the churning water calmed and became still. "Peso," the captain called, and Peso jumped again, but not as strongly this time, much to his pride. "You can come back up to the HQ." "All right, sir," Peso replied, but he stood there for a few moments to make sure that the water still wasn't rising before he went to the octochute. Much to his surprise, when he had first tried the octochute, he had found himself enjoying it. It was very similar to penguin sledding at home. He had thought that by coming here, everything would be different and miserable, but although some things were nerve-wracking, there were other experiences that he was all right with. Happy with, even. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. He saw the opening coming quickly towards him at the end of the chute, and he mentally prepared himself for it. In a second, the door opened, the lights in the HQ went into his vision, and he landed on his two webbed feet on the metal floor of the headquarters. Many of the Octonauts were already there, he noticed, except for Tweak, Shellington, and the Vegemals. The captain was back in the HQ, looking at the security cameras. Dashi was at the dashboard, hands resting on it, poised for command. Peso felt eyes on him, and he looked to the left to see Quasi staring at him from across the room. The pirate had a glare in his countenance, his brows furrowed over his normal eye and eye patch. Peso's flippers grew cold. Quasi noticed the eye contact, and after a moment shifted his glare away, but the cat was still tense. His paws were clenched. Peso started to feel sick, anxiety creeping into his stomach. What did Peso do wrong? Why did the pirate hate him? Peso stiffly turned away and pretended to look at the security cameras. He couldn't handle rejection or conflicts normally, that was something he knew, but this wasn't just a normal creature, this was a pirate. If the pirate wanted to, he could kill Peso in his sleep, or beat him up, or threaten to kill his family. He grit his beak. If Quasi so much as touched his family, he'd never forgive him. Captain Barnacles was talking into the intercom, Peso belatedly realized, not really paying attention. He was talking to Shellington, asking if the bathroom worked. Apparently the faucets were doing fine. What should Peso do? Should he ask Quasi why he was angry? Was Quasi angry with him? Was Peso overthinking things? His family always did say that he had a tendency of doing that. After all, Quasi was just looking at him. True, it was a glare, but maybe it had nothing to do with him. Maybe Quasi was having a bad day or something. Yeah, that was it. Maybe. Now Captain Barnacles was asking some of the Vegemals in the kitchen and in the garden pod if the water was working. The Vegemals turned on the sink in the kitchen and the hose in the garden pod, respectively. The Vegemals didn't need to talk. The captain was able to see through the cameras. The captain asked if it was fresh water. The Vegemals tasted the water and jumped excitedly, showing that it was. Then the Vegemals in the garden pod began to play with the water, with the orange one, Barrett, spraying it at the others with the garden hose. Peso smirked at that, trying to forget about his current predicament and forcing himself to calm down. Panicking won't do any good, especially now that the actual launch will start. Line break. Inkling sat in his chair, watching it all unfold. Two of his tentacles were steepled together, held to his mouth in concentration. He hadn't moved at all from this position, but he didn't pay any mind to that. Inkling was completely focused on the procedures, seeing if all was going according to plan. This was a special day, and a particularly risky one. It was, Inkling supposed, the day that would prove if all their work so far would come to fruition. "All Octonauts, please report to the HQ," Captain Barnacles said over the intercom. He stood tall, in an at-ease position, legs apart and paws behind his back as he looked at the security cameras. It was astonishing, the amount of professionalism the captain had. Though, the professor thought wryly, he really shouldn't be so surprised. That was one of the reasons why he asked the polar bear to join the crew, after all. It seemed like Inkling made a good choice. And it looked like he had made a good choice with the Vegemals, too. He had been very worried when Tweak had gotten upset over the Vegemals working with her. All justifiable, really. Inkling hadn't even thought about the language barrier, much to his absolute embarrassment. But thankfully, Tweak had given them a chance, and saw what he had seen. He truly felt they were a perfect addition to the team. He knew that some of his decisions in choosing the Octonauts weren't based on logic. Some of them were a gamble. The Vegemals, for one. To others, Quasi would probably be a risk, but Inkling knew that he would never be a threat. Inkling was actually more concerned about Peso. The penguin was a genius, but for the life of him, Peso couldn't see it, and his nervous tendencies could prove a detriment to the team. Inkling had to make sure that Peso could overcome obstacles, and so that was one of the reasons why Inkling had asked him to do the first aid workshop. It was pretty obvious that something like public speaking would be frightening to the young medic. Fortunately, Peso was able to pull through, with barely any hiccups, Inkling might add. And it also showed the captain's character even more. Inkling was pleasantly surprised when he heard the captain wanted to be part of the presentation. It was immediately clear to Inkling that Captain Barnacles was solely doing it for Peso's benefit, and that was a good sign. The captain was going to take care of his crew. This will prove to be fertile ground for teamwork in the future, and that's what Inkling really hoped for, that these teammates would work together as a whole, and be together as a whole. "Everyone is here, Captain," Dashi announced. She looked back at the polar bear, one hand draped over the dashboard. Inkling scanned the room, doing a quick head count. It was true. They were all there, and they looked at the captain expectantly. He didn't disappoint. "Octonauts, prepare for Phase 3. Dashi turned and pressed a couple of buttons, and a few seconds later, the captain went back up to the steering wheel. Everyone else stood where they were, filled with expectation. Shellington clutched the back of a chair. Quasi flicked his tail. The Vegemals looked at the front window with wide eyes. Inkling could feel his lips turning up into a smile. There was a dull, barely noticeable clank, and then the whir of engines. The floor started to move forward slowly, gently taking the inhabitants within it. "Here we go!" Shellington exclaimed. His beaming grin was as wide as his own, the professor was sure. The octopod continued to increase speed. At first it was comfortable. Then the Octonauts had to adjust a bit. Inkling could feel himself leaning back in his chair because of the force. Shellington positioned his feet, one in front of the other, like a lounge position. Quasi put out his arms and tail a little to steady himself. The Vegemals fell like a pile of dominoes. The water washed over the windshield, seaweed and fish whizzing by. Inkling hoped the glass could handle the water pressure. He glanced at Peso. The penguin was holding onto the counter for dear life. Inkling knew that they were heading away the Floridan coast. In his mind, he could see the city that he had visited, taste the food that he tried there, remember the faces of the locals he talked to. Those really were good memories. And they were about to make more. "Octonauts!" The captain's voice shone over the intercom. There was a satisfaction there. The professor could hear it. "Phase 3 has successfully concluded. We have officially launched." Everyone erupted into cheers. "Yow!" Quasi cried joyfully. He flung his new Octonaut cap into the air. "This is incredible," Dashi said. The Vegemals jumped up and down, and Inkling took in the scene. He had never been happier in his life.